welcome to everybody. Like any good conference, we're obviously running late because the conversation's so good, and no doubt for the third and final panel of the day. By no means we definitely, in my opinion, have saved the best for last. Our next session is going to focus on competitiveness and digital, strengthening Europe's innovation, industry and security. We've talked about values, we've talked about direction, we've talked about cooperation, and no doubt in any future that we see about the Europe we want, this is a key pillar that we have to build it on. So I'm very thankful to our really esteemed panel that we've got collected here today for giving up their time and coming and speaking with us. To my left, we have Seamus Allen, Senior Researcher of Digital Policy here at the IIEA, and I'm sure you have read his excellent contribution to the TEPSA paper that we've had downstairs. Next to Seamus is Michelle Chang, Director of the Transatlantic Affairs Programme and Professor of European Political and Governance Studies at the Department of College of Europe. Next to Michelle is Una Fitzpatrick, Director of Technology Ireland. And last by no means least, Lara Connaughton, Digital Engagement Manager at Commission for Communication Regulation, Comreg. Excellent. Thank you all again very much for being here today. So the format will be similar to what it was before. I'm going to each ask our panelists to speak for 5 minutes on a topic relation to the question. And after that, I'm going to ask a question, then I'll turn to you, the audience. From listening to your questions today, I know you've got really good meaty questions, so I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to contribute. So I'm going to ask Seamus to kick us off first and then go along the line as possible. Seamus, your thoughts?
Yes, great. Thank you, Matt. Is this working? Yep. So I'm going to talk about two big themes that are really key in the debate about Europe's competitiveness at the moment. And I'm going to be a little bit controversial. So the two themes I want to talk about are very important, but I fear they're becoming alluring mirages, I would say, in the sense that there may be a disproportionate focus upon them or a misdirected focus in relation to them. So the two things I want to talk about are the single market and AI. So starting with the single market, that's really now predominating in conversations about Europe's competitiveness and about unlocking Europe's competitiveness. And to be clear, the single market's very important. There's lots of areas where we need more integration and where it would be very beneficial. But my concern is that it's become something of a fixation or a panacea. That we could wake up in a Europe where we have a perfectly completed single market, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Europe will be magically become innovative or magically be competitive. And I think we're losing sight of that. So there's a few points that I want to make that I think are relevant to that. So in Europe, we talk an awful lot about the US, we talk an awful lot about China and how we're lagging them, for example, with regards to digital technologies. But actually, there's many sectors of digital technology where Europe is also lagging the likes of Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, countries that are very small markets that don't have anything like the market scale that Europe has. Last year, the country that was ranked as the world's most innovative country and the world's most digitally competitive country was actually a European country, believe it or not. And it was a European country that faces bigger single market barriers than any member state of the European Union. That country was Switzerland. Sweden, the same year, was ranked as the world's second most innovative country, ahead of the United States. Denmark was ranked as the world's fourth most competitive country, again, ahead of the United States. It's also worth noting that inside the US and China, there is actually huge fragmentation internally that we often forget about in Europe. There's many academics who make the point that in a variety of sectors, in some specific sectors, Europe is actually more integrated than either. Now the point I want to make isn't that the single market doesn't matter, but there's a whole range of factors that matter to having a competitive economy, to having an innovative economy. That it's not just about market size and market scale. So that's my first concern, is that we're losing sight of that. The second concern is that when this comes to policy making at a European level, we have European regulations, and sure, there's always a burden or a cost involved, but a lot of European regulations get justified on the grounds that this will help to complete the single market, and therefore the benefits will always outweigh any costs that are involved. And that's not necessarily always the case, I think. For example, most businesses in Europe, more than 90%, are SMEs. And the very large majority of SMEs don't do business across borders. And that's not because of fragmentation. That's true the world over. Small businesses start local or regional or for a particular language group. And that's the way it always will be, no matter how integrated the economy is. But sometimes we might add burdens to those businesses without actually benefiting them. The third point of concern is regulation can be burdensome, and in that case, more burdensome than it perhaps should be or needs to be. But sometimes regulation can be beneficial for things like security, but also for competitiveness. And we do see cases where member state regulation gets opposed or blocked or delayed or held up on the grounds that this regulation might fragment the single market, even though it may actually be otherwise beneficial for competitiveness. To sum up my points there, there's more than market size and scale that matters, and we need to think a lot more about market quality and market dynamism. And I would like for our debate to be refocused to that. So I'll move on now to artificial intelligence. So in EU tech industrial policy, which is a big policy focus for the Commission in general, AI is definitely dominating. So we have the Continent Action Plan from last year, the Apply AI strategy. Just a week ago, the Cloud and AI Development Act was published. There's the Invest AI initiative that's meant to mobilize 200 billion for artificial intelligence, a whole range of other initiatives. One of the flagship mottos of the Commission is this AI first policy or AI first approach, where the Commission is encouraging businesses, organizations, public services to say the first question we should ask when we're making a decision or dealing with the problem is, how can we use AI here? And I think that's the wrong question. I think that would be a very bad idea. Because the term AI is a very broad term, it can mean a lot of things to such a degree that it begins to lose meaning. And just because something technically meets the definition of AI doesn't necessarily mean that it's productive or useful or helpful. And there's a whole range of types of AI, and a very small subset of what AI is has completely taken over the public conversation about AI, taken over policymakers' attention, but is also taking over what we think of as the AI economy. The reason this is so relevant, so last year there was a study from MIT, and it showed that 90% of AI uptake by businesses has delivered zero returns. And since then, there's been a dozen major studies of a similarly reputable showing very much the same thing. And we have a situation where we have businesses that are spending billions on developing AI, and they're not making money, and they don't know how to make a profit. We see businesses that are deploying these tools, and in many cases, not all cases, but very many of them, they're not seeing productivity gains. And we're seeing cases where employees are working in places and their workflow is not improving. And in many cases, not in all cases, but certainly in many, we're seeing customers or citizens getting a worse end product or worse service at the end of it. And we're already seeing public money and EU money being invested in use cases of AI or generative AI, where I think the justification isn't there. The evidence to support its use case just doesn't exist. And it's probably not the right tool to use in a variety of situations. And this is not just a concern because we may be wasting a major amount of money, which is, of course, obviously a problem, but it's also a concern because AI will be very important for the future of Europe's competitiveness. But there's a risk that we're misdirecting resources away from AI that actually really matters, because we have this indiscriminate enthusiasm for anything that's AI, that we're not really asking the right questions. And because we're misdirecting resources, and we could also crowd out the potential for AI development by adopting AI tools prematurely that aren't really that effective. So we could actually spend huge amounts of money and still fall behind in AI. So what I would like us to see adopting is a critical AI policy that focuses very much on effectiveness, that focuses very much on results. And we need to ask questions, why is this AI making us more productive or more efficient? And in some cases, if it isn't in the short run, that might be okay if it's improving our technological capabilities overall. Thank you so much. I'll finish there.
On time, might I add?
Well,
Go ahead, Michelle, you take off.
All right, so thank you very much. So I moved to Europe about 20 years ago, and I still remember my first experience with Belgian bureaucracy at my local bank and trying to open up a bank account. Now, in the US, I had previously opened up a bank account maybe 6 months before I left. And the reason that I did this with the idea that I was going to be leaving soon was because if you opened up a new account, they were going to give me an Apple iPod, which was before they had phones, so I got a free iPod. And that was really exciting. Anyway, so I go into my Belgian bank and they start telling me how much it's going to cost me to have a current account with them. How much it's going to cost me? No iPod? You're not going to pay me? You're not going to give me something for opening up an account? That was my first lesson, that money in Europe is very expensive compared to the US. And that's bad news because there are a lot of things that Europe is going to need to pay for in the foreseeable future. We need to go and pay for defense. We need to pay for enlargement. We have a green transition. We have a digital transition. We're behind on AI. How are we going to pay for all of this? Now, the European Union, how does it normally pay for things that it wants to pay for? Well, we have the EU budget, but we know it's not that big. Maybe it'll get a little bit bigger, but as was noted this morning, it's just not going to ever be that big. We have the member states. And with the money coming from member states, we also have the prospect of a reinterpretation of competition rules that make it easier for the member states to spend their own money on state aid, and for the increasing flexibility and geopolitical considerations when it comes to the decision regarding merger policies. It used to be back in the day that we worried that this kind of thing was actually going to fragment the internal market. Now we say that it's needed for geopolitical purposes. What happened to the fragmentation of the internal market? Were we wrong about that, or do we just not care? Does it not matter anymore? We also have the famous EU strategy of mobilizing money. And we have, often talk about tens and hundreds of billions of euros of money that is going to be mobilized. But as people in this room probably know, when you say that we're mobilizing the money, it means that you don't have the money. It means that you're going to be moving around some money that was supposed to be earmarked for something else, and you've got a little bit of wishful thinking that money will come up later, maybe from the private sector, maybe from the next MFF, but it's not going to be the game changer that those figures are going to go and give us. So what are our options? Well, most recently, we are looking at common debt through NGEU, and this can go on into the future. It's very controversial, but I think that this is a way forward because MFF is too small. The member states spending their own money, that's just going to lead to increasing fragmentation, and the mobilization of money isn't really as effective as it might initially sound. But if we were to go and issue a common debt, this could go a long way towards a more unified capital market within the European Union. And on top of that, if we were to go and create a common asset, a safe asset, that this would also be very beneficial, not only for the financing of the EU's geopolitical objectives, but also for safeguarding its financial autonomy. And so European financial markets are very fragmented. This is part of why it is so expensive, despite having so much money in savings available within Europe. The Savings and Investment Union, it recognizes that. It has some ideas with the creation of pensions and that sort of thing and trying to go and mobilize that money. But it's still not on the scale that's going to be needed in order to pay for the objectives that the EU has set for itself. Draghi's famous report, published about a year and a half ago, wants to go and have some kind of money on the order of NGEU every year. That's a lot of money. It can partially come from private markets, and if we have more unified capital markets, if we have better access to capital, this will be useful for European competitiveness and European business. They will not leave Europe to go to the United States once they become successful, because if you are a successful business, it is very difficult to scale up without the money to scale up. And it's a lot easier to get that money within Europe, within US capital markets than European ones. So this would also help keep European industry within Europe. And finally, it would also be useful for financial strategic autonomy, which is an aspect I don't think we've really talked about yet so far. But the dollar, it dominates global financial markets, and the US dominates international payment systems. This is the strategic vulnerability. So we talk about the vulnerability that we have when it comes to technology. If we were to buy our fighter jets from the US, they could just, flip a kill switch. Couldn't they do that with the financial system as well? Everybody says that, of course they wouldn't do that, but wouldn't they? But thank you for that, yes. And we can also look at digital finance and the emerging transatlantic differences that we can see, whether it is the regulation of crypto or stable coins or central bank digital currencies. The US and the EU have very different ideas on how that should develop and how that should function. And without a safe asset, it will be difficult for the European Union to really have a voice in the development of this new financial ecosystem. And so I will go and stop there, and I look forward to our conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michelle. Una.
Right. How do I follow that? So listen, thank you all for joining this afternoon, and thank you to IIEA and TEPSA for hosting. As Director of Technology Ireland, it's probably no surprise I'll have a very industry focus, but Ireland sits at the heart of Europe's technology ecosystem. We really do act as a strategic bridge for global partners, and we're home to global digital innovation. In Ireland alone, the digitally intensive sector employs 1 in 8 workers and drives nearly 30% of our national exports. But obviously, as we're here in mid-2026, the global economic and geopolitical landscape is shifting beneath our feet. Artificial intelligence, escalating global technological competition, and acute supply chain vulnerabilities mean we are entering a period of major structural challenge. So the core question, I suppose, before this panel is how do we preserve Europe's capacity to act on its own while radically boosting our own competitiveness? And from the enterprise perspective, the answer is clear. We must transition from a continent that predominantly regulates technology to a global powerhouse that creates, adopts, and scales it. It's already been mentioned, but obviously the Draghi report, over the last decade, and particularly the last 5 years, the introduction of EU digital regulation has accelerated at a breathless pace. We now navigate an incredibly complex web of rules spanning GDPR, the Data Act, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the AI Act, NIS2, and the Cyber Resilience Act, to name but a few. While Technology Ireland and our partners at Digital Europe fundamentally support a harmonised common EU digital framework that builds public trust and ensures user safety, we must confront the unintended economic friction it has created. Comprehensive regulation is a necessary precondition for a thriving market, but the cumulative layering of these rules is actively overshadowing market opportunities. Technology Ireland, in conjunction with Frontier Economics, will in 2 weeks release a report titled Reducing Frictions, Optimising Interplay, which explores the digital regulatory landscape and reveals a striking picture of the lived experience of firms on the ground. I'm going to give you a sneak peek of some of the insights with 3 observations. First, on the cost of compliance. On average, digital compliance costs now consume a staggering 7% of annual EU-wide turnover for technology firms. More than a third of companies surveyed have seen their compliance costs skyrocket by over 50% since just 2023. Second, on the diversion of talent. And I know Seamus has already mentioned misdirected resources. This is a very clear example. This is not just a financial burden, it's a massive human capital drain. Internal staff time drives 69% of the costs I mentioned. Critically, 73% of firms surveyed report that highly specialised non-compliant staff, like data scientists, product engineers, and senior executives, are being heavily diverted from core R&D to answer regulatory inquiries and risk assessments. And finally, on the innovation penalty. Most concerningly, 85% of our survey respondents state that navigating full compliance has negatively impacted their innovation pipeline. So this manifests as delayed product launches, reduced feature scopes, and geographical hesitation. We're seeing a deeply troubling trend where innovative companies launch new products and features much later in Europe than in the US or the Middle East, or choose not to launch them at all. We cannot be expected to lead or even compete in a global AI race if our engineering teams are spending more time auditing past code than writing future. This brings us directly to the nexus of the industrial strategy, trade, and economic security. How does Europe protect its critical infrastructure and strategic sectors without building a digital fortress that isolates us from global capital and collaboration? So true resilience doesn't mean choosing insularity. It means mastering our deep tech supply chains. If we take, for example, the semiconductor industry, which underpins the green and digital transitions, Ireland has championed this via our Silicon Island strategy, leveraging industry academia partnerships to scale our global niche in semiconductor design and high-tech manufacturing. Similarly, about quantum technology, Europe must act with pro-enterprise mindsets. Technology Ireland strongly advocates that any future European Quantum Act, modelled on the CHIPS Act, must focus strictly on providing robust funding and legal frameworks for large-scale industrialisation and supply chain monitoring. It must not repeat the approach of the AI Act by prematurely implementing heavy, risk-based use case restrictions on a nascent frontier technology. Furthermore, we must secure our defensive and cyber capabilities. Cybersecurity is a cornerstone of digital trust, and the transposition of NIS2 and the Cyber Resilience Act are vital steps. However, the combined cost of NIS2 and Cyber Resilience Act to industry is estimated at a staggering €60.2 billion. To prevent this from devastating our mid-caps and SMEs, governments must step up and fund the regulators and expand practical compliance grant structures. So if we want an agile, competitive European Union by 2030, we believe we must take bold, practical market choices right now. For example, on the digital omnibus, which is kind of in train right now, the call from industry is actually to slow it down because there's a real push for its completion or for its kind of sign off by the 24th of June. It was described to me this week as, we're just about stopping the bleeding. And that's really not what the digital omnibus was intended for. It was intended for far deeper simplification to, in fact, achieve real fundamental change. And at the moment, I suppose the feedback is, as it currently stands, we're just about stopping the bleeding and the patient may still bleed out. So I suppose the ask, and this is one that will be made by industry, but also across Europe, is to allow more time for impact assessment, allow more time for further discussion. Do not stop the digital omnibus just because there's a timeline that you want to achieve. Secondly, I suppose, scale-up focused risk-based AI adoption. And I know we've already been talking about AI and how it can't be used for everything. From the regulatory perspective, we want to ensure that there's proportionate, predictable and risk-based implementation of the AI Act that avoids national gold plating. We must fund enterprise adoption through mechanisms like AI training vouchers for SMEs and expand the National Training Fund to build a diverse, lifelong talent pipeline. I know it's already been mentioned about the adoption. Public service, we believe, shouldn't be a follower to technology, but it should be at the vanguard. And making sure, I suppose, the appropriate application of AI to, foster that trust at societal level will be really important. We do believe Ireland is uniquely positioned to lead the charge. We think we can be a really good testing ground where European digital legislation meets global application at scale. Our national commitment, as reflected in the National Digital and AI Strategy, is to be relentless, pragmatic advocates for digital simplification, regulatory coherence, and economic impact assessments. So thank you very much and look forward to discussion.
And then last but no means least, Lara.
Thanks, Matt. I think my favorite thing that Una said was fund the regulators, definitely. So my name is Lara Connaughton and I work at Comreg, and I'll just take a moment to explain Comreg's role in Ireland because it is evolving. So Comreg is a communications regulator. So traditionally we've regulated communication services which cover electronic communication services, postal, spectrum and the like. We have new remit though in the digital space, in digital infrastructure. So we're moving from telcos, which you might think of as ducks and poles, to digital communication and infrastructure, which is actually using cloud native architecture more and more. So connectivity really is the backbone of the digital transformation, and it is so core and integral to so much of our lives, and a lot of public services are going to become digitalized as well. So at Comreg, we really believe that trust and innovation in digital infrastructure is so important for our competitiveness as a country and as the EU. Not only for users who will benefit from choosing services with confidence and choosing digital products and services with confidence and having choice, but also secure and reliable digital infrastructure will enable investment in innovative solutions for connectivity. So as part of the National Digital Strategy, which came out at the beginning of this year, titled Connecting Our People, Securing Our Future, it did highlight the importance of digital regulation in this space. And Comreg is part of the Digital Regulators Group, along with our fellow regulators in the DPC, the CCPC, and Commission Union, the media regulator. And together, we are addressing digital issues, which of course are so important for competitiveness in the EU. So Una also mentioned a plethora of files which begin with digital this and that. So at Comreg, a file that is very important for us is the Digital Networks Act, which is going to be replacing a lot of the electronic communications code. And as part of the DNA proposal, BEREC, which is the body of European regulators for electronic communications, which Comreg is a member of and has been chair of, we've published a series of thematic papers. And one thing that is, I think, important for the Digital Networks Act is going to be competition as well as competitiveness. And these are two items that are linguistically quite common and get mixed up sometimes in conversation. But we've seen in the proposal for the Digital Networks Act that competition has been almost downgraded as a core objective and that competitiveness has kind of superseded it. But competition is a primary driver of investment in innovative connectivity solutions to the advantage of all users who benefit from that choice, quality and affordability.
as well as the overall competitiveness of the sector, which is itself a result of competitive dynamics. And we do believe that effective competition supported by predictable and pro-investment regulation is a key enabler of that competitiveness. Because I think that sometimes there's a misconception that regulation is anti-economic activity. And just something Una mentioned as well about compliance costs and regulatory burden. I do believe that there is a difference between regulatory burden and administrative burden. And I think that administrative burden and minimizing that is something that everyone can get on the same page. Recently, the EU published its tech sovereignty package. And as part of that communication, it mentioned wanting businesses to spend less time on paperwork and more time on innovation, which of course is great. But this simplification cannot be deregulation. It should be avoiding duplication. It should be streamlining processes. And it cannot come at the risk of something like cybersecurity risks not being addressed as that trade-off when you talk about simplification. So that's all from my side as we kick off our conversation today.
Excellent. I think 4 excellent contributions. Seamus, I think that was really interesting, your point about how looking out, there's strategic misdirection and we have to have a rethink about that. Complemented your point, Michelle, about how is the market actually functioning the way we need it to function, or do we have to reimagine or conceptualize that? And I really lead it into your point, Una, when you're talking about the balance between red tape and strategic autonomy, and versus also that question about skills. How does that balance into what's needed there? And then, Lara, I do not regret your job, the complex role a regulator has in actually managing all these different spheres. I suppose my question in trying to combine all that, we're at an immense point of significant change, specifically when we talk about digital. 150 years ago, 2 of the biggest trades was whale fishing, obviously for lamps because we didn't have electricity, or the other one was carriage building. Obviously, those were wiped out very clearly. And we're trying to give ourselves the tool now to build and master this space that we don't fully understand where it's going, and we have people racing to go in, and where Europe's strategic autonomy goes in. You've all sort of set out a diagnosis and offered a direction of where you think your respective areas are: policy, the markets, business, and regulators. Is there any one thing you think, as policymakers in this audience, we should be really looking forward to or start considering in how we think about this? I came at you with a very big question. Don't be scared to jump in.
Maybe I'll start just in terms of, I suppose, the approach, of the compliance first, innovation second, from a European standpoint, and definitely to your point, it's not about not wanting regulation, but it's just regulation that works and avoiding the overlaps. And I think we've been in such a rush to introduce new regulation that we're not identifying where those overlaps happen or the effective impact assessment. So from our perspective, it's about kind of getting that balance right between, letting innovation happen and compliance alongside or to follow. But we're nearly doing the compliance bit first in Europe and then wondering why the innovation isn't happening. So I just think getting that balance right will be. It's a mindset shift, and I suppose with the new commission and the simplification packages and the omnibuses, we had hoped it was moving in that direction. But I suppose what we can see happening at the moment is we've got an AI omnibus and a digital omnibus happening, but at the same time, loads more stuff being regulated. And I suppose it's that twin track of. It's kind of what Europe specializes in, and it's sort of like, okay, is that our only USP as Europe, that we can just regulate? That if we can try and change that mindset, that would be very significant.
I would just follow up on that, Matt. I'm going to answer your question with a question. But one thing I do want to look at is, so people say Europe regulates and it doesn't innovate. Well, Europe is also trying to innovate, and has been trying to innovate for quite a long time, with very mixed results, I would say. I mentioned EU tech industrial policy, so AI is a big one, but it's far from the only one. So we have a Quantum Act, a Quantum Strategy, the CHIPS Act, a second CHIPS Act, talking about throwing lots of money into chips. The Digital Networks Act was mentioned. There's a whole variety of technological areas that the EU is trying to promote. And now search engine, a EU search engine again. And one of the big question that I think is very important, whether or not we should be doing tech industrial policy or not, we are doing it. And the EU is trying to innovate, whether or not it should be from the state. But doing it right is a different thing. because the EU does have a track record of having attempted to do this. So the EU attempted to have its own search engine, or rather France and Germany attempted to have their own European search engine back around 2008, and that didn't work. In terms of cloud and developing European cloud, we had Gaia X, and that didn't really meet the results we wanted it to meet. In terms of semiconductors, there's a bit more of a debate there as well, but there's certainly a line that, the court auditor's report said that the plan was disconnected from reality. So the question is, how do we do it right? Partly because I think it can be done right, but as a matter of fact, if you look at the US, or if you look at some of the Asian countries that I mentioned, like Taiwan and South Korea, the state has played a big role in driving tech innovation. So it isn't quite the case that the state can just step back and not do it, but we need to ask what was done wrong in the past and what can be done right in the future.
Shell,
Yeah.
Lara, go to Shell.
Yes. I would point out that financial market integration, when we're talking about financial markets, we're talking about a lot of money. And so that means there are people that are set to lose a lot of money when you have big changes. So we don't get big moves when it comes to financial market integration if it's not accompanied by a crisis. And this is a problem, because it also means that the drive towards financial market integration also stops once the crisis subsides. And so we saw this, about 15 years ago with the banking union project. And that is pretty much, we have the summer of 2012, the announcement of banking union. And then, so this was June, and then in July, Draghi's whatever it takes, everybody calms down. And then by September, we already see the member states backpedaling on financial market integration. And I would just point out that doing these kinds of policies under duress, which is what winds up happening if you're doing this while it's in the middle of a crisis, isn't the ideal way to make some very important policy measures. And so for policymakers in there, I would just encourage everybody to think about a way to go and do this so that we don't have to wait for a crisis. Or if we do have to wait for a crisis for political reasons, then, have the plans ready and the ducks in order, but don't just only start to think about this because the financial system is about to implode.
Do you have anything to add, Lara?
Yeah, maybe just quickly on. So I think that the balance that Una spoke about in terms of regulation and innovation, I know that Taoiseach spoke about this yesterday when the presidency priorities were announced on competitiveness, values of the union and security. And he did mention the pivot towards innovation, but the balance that it's so important that we make sure enforcement and compliance is there for the safety and security of our citizens. But I do think that we're entering an era of almost like an iterative process. And obviously, as a regulator, we don't write the legislation, but we can inform policy and shape that. And in my own experience, I have seen in things like the Data Act, the language is getting less prescriptive in an effort to future-proof legislation. So the Data Act seeks to regulate cloud in common language, but they use data processing services in case something else comes along that serves the same function but isn't necessarily called cloud. So that's something that I think is interesting, and I think we need to be engaging with stakeholders, including industry and different actors, to see how this technology is progressing so that we can have that kind of iterative process. And in the same vein of thought, what Seamus mentioned at the very beginning, we're all part of the EU, the member states, and to learn from each other. So to speak to our colleagues in Sweden, especially in the regulatory sphere, and ask, why is that going right? How is that going right? How can we bring back lessons to Ireland of that ecosystem where possible? So we can have that kind of iterative process and kind of take those lessons learned back home.
Excellent. I'm going to now turn to the audience. So fire your hand up if you want to ask a question. And just a reminder to our online audience, please don't be scared to put in your questions. I'll come to you too. I'm going to go to Jill first. She had her hand up, and then if we can go to John afterwards. I'm going to take 2 questions at a time, if that's all right.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you very much to the panel. Just to come back to Seamus's remark about that we're not steering AI in the right direction, and then to the competition between innovation and regulation. I just wondered what the panel think about the case in London, where Sadiq Khan has blocked the contract with Palantir for AI to be used by the Metropolitan Police Force. We know from, and in fact, Fatna Murphy, I think, is here present today, a former police commissioner, that the police forces have been at the cutting edge of using AI and in a very careful manner. And I just wondered, do you think that it was the narrative of how it was presented, the politicization of that narrative, that has led to quite a strong, robust response amongst the British population, who fear now that policemen and policewomen, will be stuck at their desks doing work that could have been done by AI rather than being out dealing with problems on the front line. Thank you.
And then we'll go to John.
Michelle, you made the point about the importance of savings and investment union for Europe. This is an issue for the Irish presidency. Will it push it forward? Because Ireland, my understanding is unhappy with the idea of one regulator. And it won't work unless there's one regulator. So there's a tension. Will Ireland pursue, or should Ireland pursue, Europe's interests, or what is perceived to have been a local interest? And the other is in terms of research, that Irish universities are benefiting from a significant number of top asylum seekers coming from the US who want to move out because funding has ended in the US. CERN is an example of European funding of research. Do you see a future for a European funding of research which would attract the brains from around the world? And remembering the reason why China is so successful is the research in material science. It's not just subsidies. It's they did the research which have produced great batteries, great solar panels. So Europe has an opportunity. Will we take it?
I don't know if you want to go first, Michelle, or if the panel collectively wants to answer the question about human. You want to go first? And then we'll go first and then dig into it.
Okay, I can go first. And so as far as Ireland is concerned regarding the steering of capital markets union, I really hope that the government makes this a priority in trying to go and get some momentum going. So historically, Ireland has been against the single supervisor. So this is part of the legislative proposals that are now on the docket. And I would say that from the Irish case, so in that sense, so we have the countries that have successful capital markets, that have the best developed, although globally they are small, that they are afraid of losing their comparative advantage within Europe. And so this is a concern. And it is about, like in part this is why I brought up the crisis narrative as well. Will they only do it under duress once there is a major crisis and they absolutely have no choice? Or is there room for some kind of trade-offs that could be made? And I think, historically, when it came to economic and monetary union, for example, there were the side payments that were available to some of the countries, including Ireland back in the 1990s. I don't know if this is something that would be enough to offset Ireland's concerns regarding single supervision, but I agree it's a really critical time, and everybody is saying this is a really important time and this is important, but I would be happily surprised if we saw real momentum, but I'm not holding my breath.
In terms of Jill's question, I thought it was very interesting. If I could reframe it slightly, Jill, and I hope you won't be mad at me. I think there was a really interesting question for us all about using AI to sort of streamline our work as human beings and managing large data loads. And I'm wondering from each of your perspectives that you've given, if you want to comment on that. It'd be very interesting.
Come in, not on the specific case, but just more generally a thought on AI and policing. And this is something that in the European Union is covered in the AI Act. So obviously the situation is different from the UK. But certainly just on a general note, using AI and policing, I think is the type of thing that we do want to be extraordinarily careful about. There is already cases in the US and in the UK and elsewhere where people have been misidentified by AI systems and people have been arrested, and there have been, in some cases, really serious consequences for those people, even if they're eventually cleared as being innocent and the wrong person. And the degree to which it has already happened is actually surprising, given there's all this talk about how much attention we should pay. On the other hand, I do think there is a case, to some degree, of using these automation technologies, but in an extraordinarily careful way. Something that struck me when the riots happened here in Dublin a number of years ago, there was a comment from the police in Ireland at the Gardaí about just the vast amount of video footage, hundreds of thousands of hours, and putting a human being watching that is not a good use of time, but it's also very privacy invasive, more privacy invasive than actually getting an automated system to flag, well, there is a human being at this part that is doing something that might be dangerous. So there are certain very, very careful ways of doing it that would be beneficial, but I really do want to highlight that careful part. But in some cases, privacy enhancing. Something that I would flag in the debate in Europe, because we think we're great on privacy and we're great on policing and so on. But there's been a debate that, to the most recent to my knowledge, has gone away, but is probably going to come back. And there's a constant debate about using automation to detect CSAM material, child sexual abuse material. But the proposal is that all private messages would be scanned potentially by automated technology to detect this. And in this debate, the technology just isn't effective enough for that to be something that we want to trust, but also the companies deploying it, the authorities deploying it, there's a lot of risks involved. So those are my thoughts on it.
Would the rest of the panel like to come in on this? Anybody? I'm looking to you.
I mean, maybe on the AI, I suppose in particular, I suppose it does maybe chime with why, you know, the risk-based and high-risk approach for certain use cases of AI are so important. And from an industry perspective, about the need to build that societal trust, both at the consumer end, but also as the user end of AI. And we can see more and more, you know, debate happening around AI usage in workplaces and, you know, is there a potential issue for, you know, or do employees, you know, have to be consulted about the ways in which AI is being used in workplaces and, you know, ensuring, I suppose, an understanding and a comfort with that. But those are all, you know, I think, especially in a policing scenario where you can clearly identify there's high risk. And I think when there's medium to low risk, being able to identify that clearly as well. And, you know, it is important that I suppose we allow for that kind of scenario planning to happen, and that I suppose we bring society with us. So in the deployment of, say, AI in the public sector more broadly, you know, being very honest around where we are deploying it and where the results it has garnered and what it has actually achieved, kind of back to Seamus's point at the start, like there has to be demonstrable kind of productivity gains and or efficiencies for the public for them to, I suppose, endorse this and really, I suppose, get behind it because, you know, it's a major technological change. It brings major advancements, but there are costs to it as well, and we have to be cognizant of that.
It kind of goes back to the previous panel's discussion on trust. Yeah. It was very important around that. Lara, I'm going to crack on. I was going to ask, you mentioned earlier in your remarks about the importance of legislation and about not being as prescriptive and keeping up. This seems like one of those key cases about that and where you
absolutely, and as well as the kind of content AI piece that we're talking about here, and without kind of talking directly to the scenario that was posed, there is a geopolitical element there as well of a US company being used by a UK public sector service. Obviously, neither of which are in the EU. But on legislation, the Cloud and AI Development Act is going to be very important in this space. The proposal has been launched as part of that EU tech sovereignty package. So this is a live debate for member states, including Ireland, in terms of ranking different public sector use cases or entities and how sovereign or how critical those are, and deciding which AI or cloud players can be used for those cases. So that's going to be definitely a live debate for Ireland to look at.
Michelle, do you want to comment anything, or we'll go back to the audience?
Oh, we can go back to the audience.
We'll go back to the audience. I'm sure we've got one. I'll go over this gentleman here in the red tie, and then we'll go over to Alan afterwards.
Thank you, Matt. It's more of a comment than a question because Faulkner Murphy is my name. I was the Commissioner of the Garda Síochána a number of years here, and it would be remiss of me not to make a very quick comment in relation to what the panel was saying. And I very much agree with Seamus and with Una. You have to be very careful. Mm-hmm. There's always pressure on a police force. And I had 17,000 people working with me in this. Always great ideas coming through. And there's always pressure on a police force to get up to speed and to utilise the modern automation, digital techniques. But the costs can be serious. People's freedom, people's lives could be at stake. So, yes, we push forward with it, but with caution. That said, the other side of it can be very, very fruitful because I remember we had a presentation here, and Jill will remember this. There was a professor he was a guy who invented the Prevent program in the UK around 2009, 2010. Mm-hmm. And he gave us a presentation here, and he spoke about the London riots in 2012, the Brixton riots, and the ability of the police for the first time to be able to monitor WhatsApp messages and that, and actually to see gangs gathering together about to march on situations where they were going to protest and create fires, and a little bit like what's happening the last couple of nights in Northern Ireland. So yes, and technology, I see AI as a more sophisticated extension of what has been developing in the digital space for many years. So I very much agree with the comments of the panel.
Excellent. Thank you so
I'm
much.
sure you'll be pleased with that.
No, I am. We don't mind. It was a nice, short, snappy comments. No issues at all. And we'll go to Alan over here. Sorry, I should have said, please name your name and your institution, but I think you all know that by this point.
Thank you. Two different areas. Seamus kind of appeals my inner Luddite, I have to say, about AI. I think part of the problem is that we don't really know what AI is today, and we certainly don't know what it's going to be tomorrow. And the tech bros have no idea what it's going to be like next year. So there's an unquantifiable problem there. And I admit the depth of my ignorance about AI remains unplumbed. I have no clue about it. I do have, however, a relation who used to write code for a company that organizes the shipment of coal and oil between Australia, China, and Singapore. He now uses AI to do that, but he checks it himself and he finds that it works 80% of the time. I would not like to be on a tanker or a coal ship that arrived at a docking point the other 20% of the time and found that the loading facilities were not available. As far as I know, and again I say my ignorance is extensive in this matter, now both Europe and China and the United States are all re-questioning their ideas about what AI regulation is about. The Americans were hell-bent for a long time, following the tech bros down the line saying, more AI all the time is good. Now they're having second thoughts. The Chinese are having third thoughts about it because they realize that, the surveillance state may itself end up being surveilled by people who could use AI properly. And that's only a small part of the problem. So that's one side of it. On the other side, about competitiveness, I think, Seamus, you shouldn't just push the emphasis away from SMEs. A lot of SMEs in the European Union are themselves involved in a supply chain. They're either a part of a supply chain or they're the end point of a supply chain, and they are affected by differences in regulation almost as much as companies that are importing and exporting. I read recently an account of the amount of documentation that it takes a firm manufacturing items in Brussels to transport 80 tons of product to a destination in northern France, only to find out that the maximum weight of a truck allowed in France is different to the maximum weight of a truck allowed in Belgium. And if they're making several deliveries along the point, it's kind of an AI programming problem to find out where the hell you make your deliveries and in what order. So I think SMEs, although they may not trade in large volumes abroad, are deeply affected by the competitiveness of the European economy. Thank you.
Since we had a comment and a question, we can go for a second question. But last hand up straight away out the gate. This gentleman here in second row, glasses, grey jumper. There we go. Sorry, I just script.
Thank you, Bobby McDonough again. Given that this excellent conference is about the Irish presidency, I'd like to ask any or each of the panelists whether there is a single, specific, desirable, realistically achievable thing in this area that they would like to see delivered by the Irish presidency.
So I hope you don't mind, Alan. We'll do a bit of reframing. The geopolitics of AI, if you want to touch on that. And then obviously, how do we relate this, or what should the Irish president go for it, Seamus?
Yeah, I might just come in on the point about AI. Because we often think of AI as something that's really new. In reality, it's been around for decades, but what we had decades ago is totally different to what we now often think of as AI. And in a couple of decades' time, I think the AI of the future that people mainly think of will be even more different from AI now than the AI of decades past. In terms of what AI might look like, one of my concerns that I possibly didn't mention is that the EU is very fixated on a particular variant or paradigm of AI that's currently dominant. So if you look at the Cloud and AI Development Act, for example, or even some of the modifications to other laws, They think about AI and improving AI in terms of more data, more computational power, more energy, more scale, as opposed to building better systems. And there's actually a very, very big difference between, say, the kind of the focus on the trust of AI policy and innovation in the EU compared to, say, China, for example. And perhaps the other point is a lot of the focus is really on automation. And this is probably a conversation for another time, but I think there's a distinction between automation, which can be amazing and incredibly impressive, and that's what we have, and building systems that actually begin to more resemble intelligence, which is probably more the future and the future direction. But to have that, you need a policy that's pro-innovation, but also forward-looking, and not just based on the paradigms we're currently using or are used in the past. In terms of regulating AI, because that is an important topic, and I haven't really touched that much on the AI Act yet, but overall, I have a relatively positive view of the AI Act, in fact. So the AI Act, I think, can definitely be burdensome. You know, if you have these really strict rules about how you use data to train a model, if you have rules about human oversight, if you have rules about cybersecurity resilience, definitely that seems burdensome at first sight. But if this is only for high-risk AI, by the way, and if a system is genuinely high risk, it seems crazy you wouldn't have those things there, if this is a case where someone's life can be in danger. But the other point, as a matter of fact, so there's certainly parts of the AI Act that I'm concerned about that I think are burdensome, some of the compliance or reporting requirements or conformity tests. There's definitely issues there, I think, potentially. But actually, even this really burdensome thing about trustworthy AI in the AI Act is not just a burden, which it is, but I actually think is pro-innovation. There was a study done recently in Ireland of a huge range of businesses that were trying to adopt AI, mostly unsuccessfully, like the other studies I mentioned. But there was one really interesting question where more than 50% of businesses said that they had abandoned projects because of regulatory concerns. And that sounds really bad. That sounds like the regulation is pretty terrible. And you then go and look specifically at what the issue was, and they were using the system, and they didn't really know why it did what it did. They couldn't really explain it. They weren't really fully sure what they were using it for in the first place, in high-risk case scenarios. And having these seemingly burdensome requirements, in some cases, can actually be pro-innovation, because if you want to have a successful AI system, you have to meet all those regulatory thresholds and actually build a good system that works. And in some cases, building a better system means building a system that people can actually understand. I'll finish there, I think.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point as well in terms of what do we talk about when we talk about AI. If you say AI to one person, to your family member or friend, they'll think of vibe coding, another person will think of a chatbot, another person will think of automation. And I think it's important that we're in an era where most people are using generative AI, which can create text, videos, multimedia, but we're entering into an era of agentic AI, which is quite scary in terms of AI being able to autonomously do multiple tasks, and that's another area. But I think with the AI office in Ireland, I think that's a really welcome development that will take place during the Irish presidency, and hopefully that will have a coordination role. I'm trying to, at the moment, even myself, have a schematic in terms of who is in charge of what under the AI Act in Ireland, because Comrig will have responsibilities under Annex 1 and 3, but various other regulators and bodies and entities will have various different responsibilities across different sectors. And I think even trying to get our heads around that as a country, because you have fundamental rights regulators and you also have economic regulators under the AI Act. And it's been a challenge trying to visualize that and put that all together conceptually.
Interesting. Michelle, Una, do you have anything you'd like to come in on this?
Oh, yes, as far as what might be able to be accomplished during the Irish presidency. So I talked quite a bit about the fragmentation of European financial markets. One thing that I didn't really make a big point of saying is they're also still fragile. And the Irish presidency could go a long ways in helping to go and rectify this with not only work on capital markets union, which we had been talking about, but also banking union. And in particular, deposit insurance, that Germany is more amenable to this than it had been in years past. And this could be some, important steps forward in terms of the stability and reducing the fragility of European financial markets.
Maybe I'll come in on the presidency as well. And maybe I'll empathise with government in the sense that it's actually quite a difficult half of the year from a presidency perspective, because as we all know, I think Europe tends to shut down for a lot of August. And then you've got Christmas. So what should be a 6-month presidency really becomes about 4.5 months in effect. So there's an awful lot of work to do in quite a short period of time. Obviously, from our perspective, the digital omnibus we're hoping tips over into the Irish presidency, and that there can be kind of cool heads and logic heads that kind of say, okay, hold the horses and let's actually see, is it doing what we said it was going to do, and try and inject a bit of kind of impact assessment criteria there. I think the other major thing that Ireland will have to do is the European budget. I have a sense that that is probably going to consume a lot of the presidency. I think that's probably the hardest thing to have to do with a new commission. This huge expectation for out in Brussels. You're talking to other people or other associations, huge expectations on the Irish presidency. So I can only wish them the best, but I do think the budget is going to consume a huge amount of time.
Okay. So last round of questions. So fire your hands up if you have any more. Don't be scared. We've got one here. We'll go to this lady over here first in the black, and then we'll come to you, sir, at the end of that side. Or no, we're going to go to this gentleman first, and then we'll go to the lady. No, it's all right. We're fine now. We're all right, Lindsay. Don't worry. Go for it.
Okay, thank you.
Better be a good question over at this side of the room to finish us off. No pressure.
Mats Brown from the Institute of International Relations, Prague. You have a quick question for Michelle. I just want to get back to you where you started about the lack of capital, the lack of risk capital for investment, which leads to companies having to move away, moving to the US to be able to scale up. And then we have a discussion about the European financial market. But also, as noted during the discussion here, big differences between the capital markets within the different countries. And it's of course linked also to behavior. Or on risk willingness among the population, how much you are actually willing to invest, which is a huge difference between Europe and the US in that respect. So my question is short: how much does European financial market actually solve the problem of the lack in capital?
And then this lady over here in the black blazer. There we go. The hand up. That's the one.
Hi again, I'm Sophie Cantwell-Kelly, but instead of a communications hat on now, I have my academic hat on, if that's okay. My background is migration policy research. So I'm interested in Una and Lara's opinions on the piece about avoiding duplication, but not encouraging deregulation. If you'll indulge me, just my research was exposed a lot of fragmentation and the kind of ad hoc nature in which migration policy has developed in Ireland over the last 20 years. And a lot of what I saw in the policy as it exists right now is that there is a huge amount of duplication. There's tons of stakeholders involved. There's not very much coordination about who is involved or responsible for what, and a big difference in how, say, the UN Global Compact for Migration is being monitored in Ireland versus how the SDGs has been monitored with a really clear framework. And I wanted to ask, is there a monitoring framework in place for digital and AI technology, or is that developing, or what are the alternatives to that?
Michelle, I'm going to come to you first as you've had more time to think about it, to give Uda and Lara. That's a big question to think about.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much for the question. And when it comes to the financial culture of the US versus Europe, there is for sure a difference. And we can already see that in the type of regulation, where financial regulation in Europe is very much stability oriented in a way that is not in the US. And I think that this is cultural, but this is also structural. And the kinds of incentives that we have within the respective systems and the narratives that they have about financial markets, where I do think regulation can go and make a difference. So just to give a very small personal example, I remember meeting with my financial advisor about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and he was asking me about how much I expected from Social Security when I retired. And I had no idea. And the reason that and he said, oh, so you didn't follow up, like you could look these up online. And I said, no, I assumed that there would be no Social Security by the time I retired. And he said, why did you assume that? And I said, well, that's what I've been hearing, is you have to go and prepare for your own retirement because Social Security could run out of money. And so I went for years without even knowing what that figure was, on this assumption. And this is where I think that investment culture comes in. It's not because Americans grow up so savvy about financial markets. It is because they have real incentives. And I think that regulatory changes could be made. I don't see the European welfare state going away in one fell swoop, But there can be incentivization, because I think that's where it really comes from. And the narratives that people, like wind up hearing over the years about financial markets, which in Europe is danger, danger. Look at the global financial crisis that the US brought us, which is also not a correct interpretation of the global financial crisis, but it's nevertheless what we have and why that stability orientation is so firmly embedded. And I wouldn't want to go and give up on the possibility of a stronger investment culture on the basis of that.
I can make a plug. My colleagues here, Kieran and Dan, did an excellent paper on this, and it's just out on the shelf. I'd recommend you to read it about the EU's. Have you already picked it up? Excellent. I'll come to Lara and Una for the final words.
Yeah, I mean,
the framework.
In terms of obviously migration policy, not my area of expertise, but in terms of digital policy with duplication and fragmentation, I think it's pretty well known now. I mean, we at a European level been involved with a lot of Digital Europe reports. We're bringing out our own report. I think it's well understood that there is overlap fragmentation. I don't think there's a kind of oversight monitoring. Now, there is the Digital Regulators Group at an Irish level, so I know the regulators are talking to each other. At a European level, maybe Lara could kind of build on that. I don't know yet if there are steps, and this is probably part of what we're trying to achieve with the omnibuses in terms of that, you could have triple reporting for the same incident. It's the multiple reporting and the duplication, and it kind of to the point, it's not about trying to get rid of the regulation, but actually minimize the administration, but also the gray areas. So where one regulation says one thing and another says another, but they actually may be slightly contradictory to each other. Huge amount of money has been spent on kind of legal opinions and legal advice, and that's kind of all building up with kind of the frustration. So that's really the kind of feedback that we're getting from members, is like, if we could have very clear guidance in terms of what is and isn't required, and before you keep introducing more new stuff, can we have an impact assessment about, well, what is missing? Because that was really at the end of the last commission, the feedback from industry. Okay, we've had a whole lot of new digital regulation. Can we assess, is any of this actually working? Is it making benefits for the end user, the consumer? What bits are working most effectively? And if it's not working, can we identify why? And it's all about actually protecting the consumer. So we can have all the new rules that we want, but unless we can see the impact assessment and know that it's actually having a material difference, then we're just moving bits of paper around. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's kind of two levels. So there's the legislative level, and we spoke about the digital omnibus, and the point of that is to try and simplify, and that's also under the competitiveness priority for the Irish presidency to simplify the rules. But then you have it at the regulatory level. So as Una mentioned, we have the Digital Regulators Group, which is a subsection of the Economic Regulators Network. We're all looking at digital issues. So there's 4 of us at the moment. And that's been really, really useful. It's the favorite part of my job to kind of have an almost therapy session with the other 3 regulators, that we're all kind of dealing with similar issues and the lessons learned from that. And we actually came together to create a consumer guide to digital regulation that's available on the Citizens Information Board. Because someone out on the street, if they have a digital issue, it's kind of like, where do I go? And that kind of guide hopefully helps people that if we're the pipes, as we like to say, the infrastructure, if you have a problem with your broadband or your connectivity, Commission Human being more media content, DPC being personal data, and CCPC for everything else. But it's been really, really useful to talk to each other and to figure out how can we work smarter, not harder, because there's no point in doing the legwork twice on some of these issues.
Thank you. I'm going to pass over to my colleague Barry in a moment, but I want to thank you as an audience for staying intellectually curious after the 3rd tier coffee break and asking very good questions. And I would like to take a moment to say thank you to Seamus, Michelle, Una, and Lara for your clarity, for your expertise, and for your time. I thought it was an incredibly engaging conversation and very complimentary conversation. So please give a big hand.